Eisenhower's foreign policy, his Cold War policy, and seeing some further Cold War tensions. Let's get this going here. Okay, so we mentioned that one of the things that we see in the Cold War is more unrest in what we call the Third World. We're seeing the United States be involved in places that really would have been unthinkable or unheard of prior to World War II. We saw the involvement in Korea, and now what we're going to look at is the background, just the tip of the iceberg to, of course, what becomes the Vietnam War, and looking at how this all got started. Of all Cold War conflicts, certainly of all of the Cold War proxy wars, the Vietnam War certainly stands out as being the longest up until more recently, and the one that becomes, of course, the most controversial, the most draining, and the most destructive to the United States in a number of ways. So today we're just going to look at the very background to this whole situation, talk about what this started out all about and how the United States got involved in it. But again, just as it pertained to the Eisenhower administration. So we're just looking at essentially the 1950s. So a little background to Vietnam. Vietnam, as we can see right here, you can see China right here to give you an idea of the location here in Southeast Asia. Vietnam had at one time been French Indochina. It was known as French Indochina, and it was a French colony. Of course, it's back in the days of imperialism and European colonialism and all of that. And so it had been a French colony for a while, for quite some time. So they had been, the Vietnamese people had been ruled over by the French. During World War II, it had been occupied by the Japanese. And then, so first with the French and then with the Japanese, Vietnamese people have, by this point, not been independent. They have been ruled over and exploited by other powers. And then we have a very similar situation here to what happened in Korea, and then also what happened in Germany and places like that, with being divided at the end of World War II. So you have French Indochina that has been occupied by the French and then now by Japan. And then as World War II gets going, and certainly at the end of World War II, there is more of a nationalist movement growing. We talked about that nationalism in the Middle East, which essentially means a movement towards independence, a movement saying we don't want to be controlled by France, we don't want to be controlled by Japan, we want to control ourselves, that Vietnam should be for the Vietnamese people. That nationalist movement is led by Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh becomes the nationalist leader of Vietnam that wants Vietnam to just be Vietnam, that does not want any foreign influence, and just wants to essentially be left alone. But as time goes on, Ho Chi Minh also starts to get more friendly with communism and starts to become more enamored with and starts to fall under more communist influence. So not only is he favoring independence, he's also favoring communism. But his single goal for Vietnam was independence, whether that came as a communist or not. But he does warm up to the communist philosophy by the 1940s or so. And so in the 1940s, throughout World War II, you have a war going on trying to push out the French and then the Japanese and all of that. The United States was supporting the French mainly because, they didn't want Ho Chi Minh to win, because that would mean a victory for communism. So the United States at first was financially supporting the French, even eventually paying as much as 80% of the bill for the French for their war in French Indochina, trying to maintain control over it. As time goes on, as the United States is funding more and more of that conflict, Ho Chi Minh is becoming increasingly communist. Ho Chi Minh the French are eventually defeated, and the French withdraw after nearly 100 years of ruling in French Indochina. But this does not give Vietnam full independence. After the French withdraw, Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel. So we have a situation, as I was saying, that's very, very similar to what happened in Korea, with Vietnam ends up divided. So it's divided at the 17th parallel, which you can see right here. So it ends up divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The communists, led by Ho Chi Minh, control the north. And the southern portion is led by a leader named Diem, or at least that's his last name. Diem comes to power in South Vietnam, and the United States supports South Vietnam and supports Diem. He promises, Diem is not exactly, this is an example where the United States supports a leader and a government that is not at all democratic, but professes to be in favor of the United States and claims to be fighting communism and claims to be standing against communism. So the United States agrees to support Diem and provide aid on the condition that he does start instituting democratic reforms, because Diem is essentially like a dictator, but he's promising democracy and promising elections and all those kinds of things. And the United States promises to provide aid in as long as he does that. So that's kind of how that gets started, is the United States is providing financial aid and supplies and things like that to Diem's government, hoping that he's going to turn increasingly democratic. And you also have this, idealistic, practically unrealistic idea that once that happens, people in North Vietnam will see how great and democracy is in the South, and that will inspire them to want to become to embrace democracy as well. So that's how this gets started. The United States is trying to, in the 1950s and under the Eisenhower administration, prop up Diem's regime to resist all of Vietnam falling to the communists. But as I said, Diem is not exactly a nice guy. He's not exactly a democratic leader at all. He is pretty much a dictator. He does not institute those democratic reforms as he had promised. He does not have elections. He does not make securities and safeguards for individual rights and private property and all of those things that he had talked about. In fact, he eliminated opposition. He got rid of people and, targeted people that were against him. Like I said, he essentially acts like a dictator. So instead of people warming up to the United States and warming up to the idea of democracy, they instead start turning toward Ho Chi Minh and communism and see Diem as the enemy. And so that leads to the development by the mid-1950s of forces that become called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong, these are the South Vietnamese guerrilla forces, South Vietnamese freedom fighters that are fighting against Diem's government, that are trying to get rid of Diem's government, and may or may not be communist, may or may not be in favor of Ho Chi Minh, but they are attacking and trying to sabotage and trying to undermine and leading all this guerrilla warfare against Diem's government. So that is, when we get to Vietnam, or if you know anything about the Vietnam War, the United States' enemy oftentimes in the Vietnam War was not necessarily the North Vietnamese. It sometimes it's the Viet Cong. It's the South Vietnamese guerrillas that are fighting against Diem's government. So at this point, the United States is providing aid as far as military supplies and advisors, meaning like people to train South Vietnamese troops and people to, educate them on how they could defend themselves. But we haven't yet seen the United States actually start sending actual combat troops to Vietnam just yet. But the United States starts to prop up the Diem's government, fighting against the Viet Cong, trying to suppress this Viet Cong revolution because of a wisdom that they had, a general theory, you've heard of before. This was referred to, I think, when we talked about Korea, this idea of the domino theory. And the domino theory specifically referred to Southeast Asia. And it was this theory, think about dominoes. The whole idea with dominoes is you stack them up and then you knock one over and they all fall over. So this was the idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, then all of Southeast Asia was going to fall to communism. So this is why we will start to see the United States working so hard and trying, getting further and further and further involved in this conflict, desperately trying to keep this small, seemingly insignificant country to the United States from falling to communism, is because they don't want the rest of Southeast Asia to fall to communism as well. So that's how the United States gets involved in it from the beginning, is they want to support Diem because he stands against communism supposedly and stands against Ho Chi Minh. And they also are trying to suppress this Viet Cong guerrilla rebellion that's starting to brew and fester in South Vietnam as well. So trying to prop them up, support them, give them the ability to defend themselves against that. That is how the United States first starts to get involved. But again, by the 1950s, it is still relatively minimal compared to what it's going to turn into. To round up the Eisenhower era out, talking a little bit specifically about the United States' relationship with the Soviet Union, which was not going so great throughout most of the 1950s. There was some hope in the beginning, or earlier on, that maybe there was some relaxing of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, mainly because Stalin dies, and I cannot remember exactly what year that was, but Stalin eventually dies. And upon Stalin's death, there was a great hope that maybe there was going to be reform and maybe there was going to be change within the Soviet Union. Maybe that would mean the end or the collapse of the communist government in the Soviet Union. Of course, that ends up not happening. Stalin's successor is Nikita Khrushchev. So Khrushchev takes Stalin's place as the premier, the leader of the Soviet Union. And there was hope at first that with Nikita Khrushchev as the leader of the Soviet Union, that there could be more peace, that there could be more cooperation, that there could be more smooth relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union. Khrushchev himself talked about a peaceful coexistence, talked about wanting to end the arms race with the United States, talking about how we know no one's going to actually win this. This only results in mutually assured destruction, as we talked about. But in the end, that ends up not being the case. And tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union are not going to thaw, but are going to become even more intense because of several specific events. Some of those events that are going to lead to further tensions and show us that Khrushchev's leadership isn't going to bring about a significant change. Some of that has to do with the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Many of you know that Sputnik was a Soviet satellite. This was the Soviets' first launch of a satellite into space. And this was alarming to the United States for a number of reasons, and it does some important things. Remember that the United States really considered itself to be the leader as far as technology and education and innovation, all those things. It was the United States that developed nuclear technology, all that sort of stuff. And so the launch of Sputnik and the fact that the Soviets beat us into space and the Soviets were able to, launch a satellite into space before the United States, this really challenged the United States' technical superiority. It really, rattled the whole idea and shook the United States' confidence in having that technological superiority, that we were the smartest, that we were the most innovative, and that we had all the cool technology. This really pulled the rug out from under us in that sense and really started a lot of people. And again, brought about great concern that the Soviet Union was surpassing the United States. The Soviet Union was getting ahead of us, that they were doing better than us. And so this intensifies that rivalry, it intensifies that suspicion, and it also leads to the space race, as I'm sure you know. This is going to really motivate the United States to get moving and to really invest a lot of money and a lot of innovation, a lot of time into space travel. So we will see the United States government, the federal government, actually put more federal money into education, which typically they did not do that. That was usually something that was funded entirely by states, but they wanted to invest in education, particularly in technical education, in science, and math, and engineering. We're going to see the establishment of NASA as a result of this to make sure the United States was getting ahead in the space race. And this also intensifies the fear of Soviet spying. Think about it. For the first time, people know that there's something floating around in space, that's orbiting the Earth, and who knows what it could be doing, taking pictures, taking recordings. People were very, very fearful that this was going to mean Soviet spying, that they were going to be listening in on us, that they were going to be looking at our military equipment and all these sorts of things. They were going to learn all of our secrets. So it really intensifies those kinds of fears as well. And speaking of spying, another incident that doesn't do too much to assist or to help the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union is something known as the U-2 incident. The U-2 was an American spy plane. These were planes that were designed, these were some of the new military technology designed to try to, evade radar and stuff like that and take pictures and do reconnaissance missions. And one of these U-2 planes was shot down while flying over Soviet territory. And the Soviet Union says, hey, we shot down your spy plane. And Eisenhower's response is, as a lot of government's response usually is to things like spying, was, no, we don't spy. That's not our plane. We didn't do that. So Eisenhower is publicly denying that any spying was taking place and the United States was not flying such missions. What we didn't know when Eisenhower was saying all that stuff was that the Soviets actually had the plane and they had the pilot, that the American pilot had survived that crash or survived being shot down, and they had him as a prisoner. So you have Eisenhower publicly saying, no, that wasn't us, we don't spy. And then the Soviet Union says, well, here's your pilot. And so it was very embarrassing for the United States. We exposed the secret spy missions that the United States was engaged in. And again, a very big public embarrassment for the Eisenhower administration. And it certainly doesn't do very much to assist or to help the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union get any better. And also to further tensions, and this is going to lead us into one of the hotter showdowns of the more tense showdowns of the Cold War that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, and that is things taking place in Cuba. To make it very quick, Cuba, as you know, just to remind ourselves, that had been a colony of Spain long ago. It had gained its independence as a result of the Spanish-American War, and the United States had exhibited a lot of control over Cuba ever since then. You may remember the Platt Amendment and all that kind of stuff. And that intervention and that, sort of breathing down Cuba's neck all the time made some Cubans very resentful, and they resented the United States, and they wanted the United States out, and they wanted the United States to, stop meddling and all that kind of stuff. And so this leads to the rise of, anti-American leadership that just this whole nationalist movement. Same thing we saw in the Middle East. It happens in Cuba as well. And so we start to see the rise of Fidel Castro by the 1950s. And you may have heard of Fidel Castro before. So Fidel Castro comes to power and gains popularity throughout the 1950s because he is taking this rather anti-American stance, wanting the United States to butt out essentially, and wanting Cuba to have their own, to basically be independent and not have United States influence so much. And as time goes on, we saw with Ho Chi Minh and several others, Fidel Castro becomes increasingly communist. Not so much because he truly loved communism at first, but because he didn't like the United States. And so, that's kind of what pushes him to those communist ideals. But once he seizes power in Cuba and takes over Cuba, he embraces support from the Soviet Union, as you can probably imagine. So essentially what this means is that Cuba has now fallen to communism as well. And why that would be particularly scary to the United States is, unlike Vietnam and unlike Korea and China and all those places, Cuba's only 90 miles away from the coast of Florida. So now you have a communist takeover and a Soviet ally right off the coast of the United States. So this is particularly distressing. And the United States, as a result of Castro's coming to power, breaks diplomatic relations with Cuba, which is kind of like a precursor to war. And that relationship has been strained ever since. It has never been good after that. And also at this point, Eisenhower is going to start making plans and is going to authorize plans to try to overthrow Castro. So that's something that will not happen. We won't see that attempt anyway until the Kennedy administration. But he does authorize the plans for a CIA operation, what's going to become a CIA operation, a secret force to begin training for an invasion of Cuba to try to dislodge Castro, to try to overthrow him. And we'll look at that in a couple of weeks and see how that ended up being a complete and total disaster, making things even worse. So the situation with the Soviet Union continues to be strained. We continue to see lots of tension there, and we'll continue to see that stuff escalate even further as we get into the 1960s, particularly with that Cuba situation when we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis shortly.